Today is Thursday, 1st August 2024, and we seem to be on the brink of a major crisis and confrontation in the Middle East. Now, before I proceed and discuss what has happened, or what is more likely what is about to happen, let me correct a certain amount of information from my preceding video. This is connected to the rocket attack which took place on Saturday, which killed 12 youngsters in a settlement on the Golan Heights, the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Now, there's been an enormous amount of obfuscation about this event, and it's only very gradually that I've begun to get a clearer understanding of this event. And I'm going to say straight away that I'm very grateful to the various members of the community, people on the threads and in other places who have been writing about this and who have been explaining to me the situation. Firstly, as I discussed in my previous program, it's clear that the youngsters who were killed came from the Druze and Christian communities of the Golan Heights. Now, these are the occupied Golan Heights. They are occupied by Israel. Israel considers them, I believe, considers this territory to be part of Israel, or so I understand. The rest of the world does not. The rest of the world considers the Golan Heights, this area of the Golan Heights, to fall within the territory of Syria. In fact, this was Syrian sovereign territory up to the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, the key point is that I was quite wrong in suggesting yesterday that apparently Druze soldiers serve in the Israeli army. Certainly, those who live in the occupied Golan Heights do not do so. Well, perhaps some volunteer, but there is no conscription amongst them, and they do not willingly serve in the Israeli armed forces. In fact, as I understand it, the people who belong to the community amongst whom, from whom these youngsters who were killed came, the people of this community overwhelmingly consider themselves to be Syrians. Their continued loyalty is to Syria, which is the country which, as I said, most of the world considers is the true sovereign state that encompasses this particular territory. So, suggestions that I made in my program yesterday that some of the people who might have been killed might have come from a community that had some connection, political affiliation to Israel, is completely wrong. Now, of course, that makes it even more extraordinary that the Israeli authorities should be using this particular tragic event as an argument to launch this wave of assassinations across the Middle East. They're not attempts, they're actual assassinations across the Middle East, and to escalate the situation in the way that they have done. The young people who were caught up in the tragedy on Saturday were not, in fact, so I understand, properly speaking, Israeli citizens. In fact, they considered themselves to be citizens of another country, Syria, which is in a state of war with Israel. Anyway, that's the first thing to say. The second point, which I also wanted to make, is that given what happened, given the identity of the young people who were killed in that rocket attack, it's called a rocket attack, though it's clear it was a missile strike. It seems to me that it's absolutely obvious, it must be absolutely obvious, that this cannot have been an intentional attack by Hezbollah. I cannot understand, I do not see what the logic of Hezbollah intentionally launching a missile strike against these people would be. It's been widely suggested, though nobody's provided any evidence, that these people were killed by a Israeli air defense missile that fell to earth after failing to intercept a Hezbollah missile or rocket. Now, whether that is so or not, I don't know. Again, as one would expect, there would need to be an investigation. It might have been, for all I know, a Hezbollah missile that went astray, or it might have been an Israeli air defense missile, as some people say. Again, one would require a proper independent investigation by a neutral third party to establish what was the case, which will never happen. The essential point to make, the only point that I think is relevant, is that whatever happened, it cannot have been an intentional attack by Hezbollah. It makes no sense to suggest that it was. So, clearly, and this is my underlying point, the Israeli government has been seeking a major escalation. As we discussed on the Duran about a week ago, as I mentioned on programs made in this channel at the time, it was absolutely obvious at the time of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington and on the occasion of his speech to Congress that Prime Minister Netanyahu was intending to make the most of the opportunity which had been presented to him by the political turmoil in Washington, the decision by President Biden not to seek re-election in the presidential election in November, the rise of his Vice President Kamala Harris, who will shortly be acclaimed as the nominee of the Democratic Party in that election. As I said, this has created a temporary vacuum of power in Washington. More and more countries around the world are apparently discussing this. I understand that this has been a major topic of conversation in China, for example, on the social media and even in the media there, the domestic media there. Anyway, Prime Minister Netanyahu is making use of this opportunity that has been provided to him by this time window, this vacuum of power that now exists, to try to reshape the Middle East, the events in the Middle East, in his favor, and as he would say, in Israel's favor, by basically pursuing a policy of confrontation and war in the Middle East. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, I personally have no doubt at all that the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran was in part or wholly intended, firstly, to embarrass, even indeed humiliate the Iranian government, provoke it into a military reaction, and, by the way, to remove from the scene the man who was not just the political leader of Hamas, but, as has been pointed out to me by, for example, Eve Smith, one of Hamas's lead negotiators. In fact, arguably, Hamas's lead negotiator in seeking to agree the terms of a ceasefire in the conflict in Gaza. The Israeli government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has never shown any predisposition to agree to a ceasefire, despite resolutions from the Security Council requiring that it do so, and despite an order from the International Court of Justice that it cease military operations in Gaza. And President President Biden, the US President, President Biden, has been talking at great length over many weeks about negotiations taking place in Qatar between the United States and Israel, between Hamas and Israel, to agree a ceasefire. The president has spoken about the two sides having accepted the US proposed framework for that ceasefire. I've never seen any actual evidence that that is really the case, by the way, but anyway, that's what President Biden has said in various discussions. And, well, Israel has now assassinated the man who was the chief negotiator in those ceasefire negotiations on the Hamas side. Now, quite apart from everything else, quite apart from the fact that this obviously is a blow directed at Hamas itself as an organization, and of course a massive humiliation for the Iranian government, given Haniyeh's role in the negotiations which the Biden administration was sponsoring and which the president himself was sponsoring, well, I would say that this is something of a humiliation, a blow against President Biden and the Biden administration as well. President Biden has promoted these negotiations. Perhaps he's never felt particularly done so with any very great sense of conviction, but he has. He's spoken out in their support. He's talked about how he wants these negotiations to succeed. He's talking about how the negotiations were being conducted within a framework that he had outlined. And now the lead negotiator and political decision maker of one side has been eliminated by the other side, by the side, in fact, with which the United States is allied. And, well, I would have thought, in normal circumstances, that the President of the United States, President Biden, would be absolutely furious about this. There's no sign, however, that he's made any public complaint or even private complaint about this to Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's worth pointing out that after Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to Congress, he actually met with President Biden in the Oval Office. One wonders whether he mentioned to President Biden that the Israelis were considering conducting an assassination attempt on Mr. Haniyeh. One presumes not. One assumes also that if Prime Minister Netanyahu had disclosed that fact to President Biden would have told him under no circumstances even consider doing any such thing. I'm assuming, in fact, that Prime Minister Netanyahu had said nothing about it, even though it's a virtual certainty that this operation was already, by that point, at an advanced planning stage, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself was aware of the fact. So the conclusion I have to reach, based on all of this, and to some extent, obviously, I'm putting pieces together of a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, I don't know whether all of this is exactly correct, but the assumption I must make, based on the information I have, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has basically stuck up two fingers, if I can put it like that, at President Biden himself. He's told him, in effect, as a result of this assassination, I'm no longer going to pay any attention to anything that you say. You might still, in theory, be President of the United States. You might be formally President of the United States, but I don't take you seriously anymore. in the Middle East. From this moment on, I'm going to do whatever I choose, based upon my assessment of Israel's best interests, which I also believe, regardless of what you might say or think, are also the best interests of the United States. I don't think I can ever remember an occasion when a president of the United States has been treated in this sort of way by the Prime Minister, the leader of a country which is, after all, a US ally. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's a number of observations I want to make about the situation that we are in today. Now, yesterday, the Israelis made a further announcement. I've been talking both in today's program and in yesterday's program about the assassination of Haniyeh and of Shukr, the Hezbollah commander, as having been carried out by Israel. I've no doubt that that is the case. I cannot imagine that anyone else in the Middle East, except the Americans, by the way, have the capability to carry out assassinations of this kind. So I'm confident that it is indeed Israel that has carried out these attacks. The Israelis, so far as I know, have not denied the fact, though they've not admitted to it either. But yesterday they did admit to another assassination, though perhaps on this occasion one can be a little bit more generous and say that this wasn't an assassination exactly, because the person that they've just announced that they've killed, and this time the Israelis have confirmed or are saying that they have killed him, is a Hamas military commander, Mohammed Deif. And Mohammed Deif, according to these Israelis, was killed last month being June, in Gaza, in an area near Khan Yunis, and the result is that actually it was 3 weeks ago, so it would have been in July. So the attack took place in Khan Yunis, and the Financial Times says the Israeli military targeted Deif and other top officials in the Palestinian militant group in a series of strikes on the outskirts of the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis 3 weeks ago, killing dozens of Palestinians. So dozens of Palestinians were killed over the course of these attacks. This is according to the Financial Times. But one of them, according to the Israelis, was Mohammed Deif. Well, this might have been a targeted attack on Mohammed Deif, in which case I think it would be accurate to say that it was carried out, that it is an assassination. But it is an assassination which is at least one that was carried out on a place where a battle is actually taking place. And Mohammed Deif is an enemy commander, though if it is true that dozens of Palestinians were also killed over the course of this attack, and if it is also the case that some of these Palestinians were civilians, then I ought to say that the question of proportionality in war crimes law inevitably intrudes itself, and whether it was appropriate to attack Mohammed Deif in these kind of circumstances under war crimes law, if hundreds or dozens of civilians were certain to die as well, is an open question, but one which I will leave to the lawyers, the lawyers who understand these questions better than me. The point is that even whilst the Israelis have not formally admitted to their involvement in the murder, or rather the assassination, let's call it an assassination, of Haniyeh and of Shukr, They are now confirming that they were the party that carried out the assassination of Mohammed Daif in Gaza 3 weeks ago. So that tells us, that increases the number of top officials from Hamas and Hezbollah, who the Israelis claim to have killed who appear to have killed over the last 3 weeks, to 3. And of course, the timing of the announcement of the killing of Mohammed Daif must appear in Tehran and amongst Hamas's Arab allies to be even more provocative. Again, the Israelis appear to be making a point that they're going to conduct this policy of assassination. They didn't just start with the 2 latest killings, those of Ukr and Haniyeh. They began several weeks ago when they killed Mohammed Daif in Gaza. And again, I wonder whether this killing was discussed by Prime Minister Netanyahu when he met with President Biden roughly a week ago. But anyway, let's not explore that more deeply either. So we see here a pattern of escalation. I don't think there's any other word to describe it. We see that the original pretext for all these assassinations, the attack, the rocket strike rather, or missile strike on the settlement in the Golan Heights, which killed those youngsters, really doesn't stand up to much examination. And besides, as I said already, it was already obvious to me from Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments to Congress, his extraordinary statement about how if the United States and Israel fight together, the outcome is simple, they win. It was clear to me that he's looking for a war in the Middle East, and one which he anticipates will involve Iran and, by extension, the United States. Now, there is intense alarm about these events around the world, and at the moment, everybody is looking at what the Iranians are going to do. And of course, we have reports appearing today in the Financial Times about European and Western officials contacting the Iranians, pleading with them to show moderation, to show restraint in the face of these extreme provocations. And let me repeat again that the attack on Haniyeh in Tehran on the very same day that the president of Iran was being inaugurated is both a humiliation for Iran and an extreme provocation. And I must say that it's always fascinating to me how whenever we get into these situations where Israel does something of this nature, European and American officials rush to the Iranians, who they often, by the way, mock and ridicule for their supposed lack of capabilities, as they did following the Iranian missile strike on Israel a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, it's always fascinating to me how after these kind of Israeli attacks, the European and American diplomats rush off to Iran or talk to the Iranians, begging them to show restraint. There's little sign, as far as I can see, that they ever actually go to the Israelis, tell the Israelis to show restraint, or tell the Israelis that they must show restraint or take action, which they certainly have the power to take, to compel the Israelis to show restraint. It is always the Iranians who are asked to show restraint in these situations. And of course, when the Iranians do show restraint, as night follows day, the articles in the Western media start to appear, published by various neocon-oriented journalists, that Iran has shown weakness, that its bluff has been called, that this shows that Iran can be attacked and defeated with the greatest of ease, that any action taken against Iran is not going to result in any consequences because Iran is unable or incapable or too cowardly to respond to the kind of action that has been taken against it. Anyway, put all that aside, as I said, there are now urgent calls, according to the Financial Times, to Iran to exercise restraint in this situation. And maybe the Iranians will, but as I understand it, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has now, according to American media reports, apparently indicated that this time a retaliation, a rather more fierce retaliation than the one that Iran undertook a few weeks ago with the missile attack that took place, that a rather more kinetic and fierce retaliation this time is going to take place. And at least one Iranian agency, and I'm not sure which one, has actually used a very loaded word to describe what Iran may be planning to do. They've said that Iran is now preparing a special military operation against Israel. Now, the words special military operation are, of course, borrowed from the Russians. The Russians refer to the operations that they're conducting in Ukraine, the military conflict in Ukraine, as the special military operation. At one point, by the way, back in 2022, I thought that the Russians might change that title, but they have stuck with it ever since the military conflict, the armed conflict in Ukraine began in February 2022. Now, of course, the special military operation in Ukraine is a war by any other name. It is an operation on a huge military scale. We see missiles launched every day against Ukraine. We see thousands of people dying in Ukraine. I'm going to discuss this later in the program. We see bitter fighting taking place in Ukraine. So when the Iranians use an expression like special military operation, if they're wanting to create the impression that the action Iran is going to take is going to be on the scale of what the Russians are doing, then frankly, we are looking at a war in the Middle East, an all-out war between Iran and Israel, one which is certain to pull in more and more countries. Now, of course, other Iranian officials have spoken in a more measured way, and there was a report from, I believe, an Iranian diplomatic mission in some place or other, which said that Iran will respond, but that it will be in some more stealthy fashion. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the Iranians, if they do respond in what they call a stealthy fashion, if, for example, and I don't want to suggest anything, but if they respond to these assassinations carried out on their territory with assassinations, counter-assassinations of their own, well, first, that has the potential to spiral out of control with the Israelis or whoever is the target of these assassinations, perhaps feeling obliged to respond, but in kind. But beyond that, given the mood in Jerusalem, given the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the people around him Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and the others appear to be spoiling for a fight. Well, if there is an assassination, say, of an Israeli official, they're going to say again that it is Iran that is responsible, and in light of what the Iranians are now saying, that might be true, and they will say that they will respond with every available means, and we will still find ourselves heading towards war. Now, the American media was saying yesterday that Ayatollah Khamenei has instructed the Iranian security and military services to carry out their response against Israel within 72 hours. Now, we are, if that is correct, coming very close to that time. Most probably, by the time this program is published, the Iranian response will not yet have happened. But by the time I do my next video, perhaps it will. We are heading towards an immense crisis. And I have to say that this time, I really do not see that there is a break. The only way that this situation could, in theory, be brought under control would be if the United States government and the European governments acted together, if they were to publish statements saying that these latest Israeli actions, and making it clear that they do consider these actions to have been carried out by Israel. After all, European and American governments are never slow to blame the Russians for, murders and assassinations and sabotage events when they happen in their territory. So I don't think they should feel any need to show reticence where the Israelis are concerned. Anyway, if the European or American governments were to make it clear that this behavior that the Israeli government has just undertaken is completely unacceptable, that Israeli officials who are responsible should immediately resign from their positions, and that the United States and Europe will insist that a proper response from Israel take place, and that those who are responsible for these events be brought to account. And they should also make it clear that unless this happens, action will be taken, preferably, I should say, this is my own idealized version of what Western governments should do. Action should be taken through the United Nations, through the mechanism of the Security Council, and that on this occasion, Israel, unless it complies, could face Chapter 7 sanctions. Now, that, I think, might just bring this situation back under control. Is there any realistic possibility that the United States, the Biden administration, in the middle of an election, with a president who is, as I said, essentially unable to exert his authority, European governments who've shown a marked unwillingness either to criticize Israel or to break with the United States or to act beyond where the United States is prepared to go? Is there any possibility that Western governments would act in the way that I have just described? Well, of course, the short answer is no. But again, as I've said many times in many programs, it's the only reason I posit these options is because I don't want it to be said, as I'm sure it will be, that there was nothing that could have been done, that this was a runaway train that could not be stopped. And if there was some great smash in the Middle East, well, that was no one's responsibility because no possible action could have been taken. The fact is, there are lots of things that the American and European governments could, in theory, do in this situation. The fact that for emotional and political reasons, and for reasons of, I have to say this, in the case of some politicians, personal self-interest, they will not do them, is another matter. The responsibility remains, and perhaps we will also see the accountability one day. Now, I'm going to finish this program with one last observation about the events of the last couple of hours, these very dramatic and very dangerous events. Firstly, well, actually two observations. Firstly, we're probably, if we are going to be facing a major crisis in the Middle East, a giant smash, it is unlikely to be as containable as the previous Middle East wars, the ones of, say, 67, 1967 and 73. It'll probably escalate far beyond that and last very, very much longer. And whilst that is the case, it will dominate the news and it will shape the news. It will dominate and shape the news in the United States. It will affect the course of the presidential election. And, by the way, in terms of Ukraine, it will inexorably and unavoidably lead to the conflict in Ukraine losing much of its international interest, though not, I would suggest, its importance. So that's one thing I want to say. The second is a minor point, but it's one that I do want to bring up. I've received a great deal of pushback from all sorts of people about my comments in my program yesterday about the failure of the Iranian security services in protecting Haniyeh whilst he was in Tehran. An awful lot of people, by the way, agree with me, but an awful lot of people don't. And it's been many times suggested that it's impossible to protect everybody across a huge country like Iran. Well, nonetheless, I do stick to my view. Now, the very latest information that we've got about this particular assassination, I don't know whether this is true or whether it's not, but two theories have been articulated as to how it was committed. One, that a bomb was planted in the apartment that Haniyeh was occupying and that it exploded whilst he was there. And the second is that the apartment was struck by a precision-guided missile, which not only was precisely targeted at the apartment building, but which might even have struck Haniyeh himself. Now, either of these eventualities points to a catastrophic failure in security. If a bomb was inserted into the apartment and into the building where Haniyeh was located, then clearly the security of the building was, well, non-functional. If it was a missile, as the second theory suggests, well, the likeliest way in which that missile was launched was presumably by a drone. And given that we're talking about a precision-guided missile, I'm going to guess that it was some kind of anti-tank missile. It means that a drone was able to enter Tehran, fly around Tehran, and take position and launch a missile at this building, and then again the Iranian security services were unaware of its presence and did nothing to prevent it taking this step, despite the fact that Haniyeh, high-profile individual, somebody who the Israelis would quite plausibly have in their sights, and someone, therefore, whom the Iranians ought to have realized was at risk and should have therefore have taken action to protect. Now, these are both theories about the assassination. The Iranians, of course, are saying very little up to now about what happened. But one way or the other, I can't help but feel that a major security lapse has indeed taken place, and unfortunately, it has been one of many. I've been hearing about assassinations of scientists and officials and all sorts of people taking place in Iran, and this has been underway for decades, literally decades, and there doesn't seem to be anything that the Iranian security services are able to do to get on top of the problem. I'm going to suggest that probably the Iranian internal security services are very fragmented. That seems to be part of a pattern in the way much of the Iranian governmental structure is organized, that they're very fragmented, which means that there is no single person or entity that has responsibility and overall control. And I'm also going to suggest that it's quite likely, in fact, very likely, that many of the best people, at least the most proficient people in this kind of thing, have been spread out across the Middle East, operating the various cells that Iranian intelligence has been extremely skilled at creating over the last 15 years. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East in this program. I have never been as concerned about the situation in the Middle East as I am now. I've always been worried. On the Duran, we have always been worried, ever since the events of 7th October, that despite the desire of Arab and Middle Eastern and indeed the governments, including, of course, the Iranian government. And by the way, since I'm talking about Arab governments, I should say that the Saudi king has apparently addressed a very friendly letter to the new incoming president of Iran, assuring him of Saudi Arabia's wish to continue to build on the rapprochement negotiated with the help of China last year. But anyway, despite all the efforts of Iran, the other Arab states to maintain restraint in this situation, it has always seemed to me, from the moment that the operation took place, the Israeli operation began in Gaza, that war, all-out war, though not inevitable, was a distinct possibility, and that the risks of that happening were exceptionally high, dangerously high. And we are now close to that very situation. And we're close, and I want to just finish by saying this, close to this very situation, not because Israel is strong and confident, but because, on the contrary, the events of 7th October remain a massive shock. The failure to destroy Hamas in Gaza and to end the war there have been another profound shock as well. And because there is growing stress and uncertainty and fear within Israel itself. I understand all those fears. I understand where they come from. I do not think that this pattern of escalation is the correct way to address them or to resolve the causes of those fears. But unfortunately, those fears exist. Political leaders in Israel have taken advantage of them. And, well, here we are. The war that I have always feared now looks like it's about to start. I might be wrong. It may be that at the last moment something will happen that will cause one side or the other, presumably the Iranians at this point, to draw back. I absolutely do not want to see a war in the Middle East, not under any circumstances, but I fear very much that it is coming. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation in the Middle East. Now, over the course of the last two programs, I have been making various comments about the fact that we look like we're seeing from the West growing recognition that there is that the war in Ukraine, the attempt to defeat the Russians, has failed, that the Russians have the advantage, and that they're gradually pushing westwards. In fact, not so gradually anymore. We'll come to the military developments shortly, but that the Russians are pushing westwards, that there is no realistic prospect, that there is in fact no prospect whatsoever, realistic or otherwise, of Ukraine recovering the territory that it lost after the 2014 events, including the territory it has lost since the start of the special military operation. And that the only way forward, therefore, the only logical way forward, therefore, if Ukraine is to survive in some form, is through negotiations. And, well, yesterday, after I did my program, there was a lot more details about the comments made by the president of Finland, Alexander, I believe his name is pronounced Alexander Stubb. Now, Mr. Stubb is very well known, including to some people I know who they are personally acquainted with him. Anyway, he is very, very well known for his very strongly, trenchantly anti-Russian views. But nonetheless, he's come forward and said that negotiations can happen, and that Ukraine can't realistically expect that these negotiations will happen subsequent to the return of its territory. Negotiations should take place even without the lost territory being returned to Ukraine, and even without any promise from the Russians that the territory or any part of it should be returned. And Stubb also told the Ukrainians that this is a good moment for them to negotiate because they're actually in a strong position, even though they're losing ground all the time, even though they're suffering heavy losses, even though the Russians are getting stronger and stronger all the time. Nonetheless, Ukraine is in a strong position to conduct negotiations because currently it is continuing to receive military support from the West. The period when military support was not being provided by the United States is gone ever since Congress authorized military support for Ukraine, and that means that Ukraine's position is now so strong that they can afford to undertake negotiations. Now, the last part of his comment, and I'm not quoting obviously his exact words, to me looks like a veiled warning to the Ukrainians that perhaps it would be wise for them to start negotiations now, because if they don't, there is a risk, especially if the Trump-Vance team win the election in November, that the aid to Ukraine, the military aid to Ukraine from the United States might again stop. And by the way, there is an article in Time magazine which is now also saying that the other side, Kamala Harris, well, she might not want to, break with President Biden's policy over Ukraine, but that her relationship with Zelensky himself, well, was not perhaps as good as perhaps Zelensky might have wished, which is perhaps a hint that a President Harris might also be less enthusiastic about shoveling more and more weapons and more American tax dollars to Ukraine. Just saying. But anyway, put all that aside. That was what Alexander Stubb said. And Jeff Roberts has also pointed out to me that there's been a rather interesting article in Strana. Strana is one of the best Ukrainian media sites. I don't always agree with them by any means, but they are nonetheless, in my opinion, a very good media site. Critical of the Ukrainian government. I believe they function. They're based outside Ukraine now. Anyway, they have also said that perhaps there's now a time window to begin negotiations. They seem to think, for some reason, which I don't quite understand, that the election period in the United States is the right time to begin those negotiations. And that for all those reasons, negotiations really ought to begin now, and that Ukraine would be well advised to follow the example of Alexander Stubb. Strana does concede that there are major obstacles to negotiations and strong opposition to negotiations from almost every side in the conflict. Now, the one weakness, in my opinion, with Strana's discussion is that it appears to assume that the Russians are also suffering losses on a comparable scale to the ones that Ukraine is, and that for them, in light of this, they too perhaps need to come to terms now. And Strana also takes the view that events on the battlefronts point more to a stalemate than to a decisive breakthrough on the part of the Russians. Well, I have to say, I don't agree with this view at all. I think, as I said, that the situation, on the contrary, is becoming more critical for Ukraine all the time. And I think that is the reality. And I think those who advocate peace talks at this time, given that Russia formally has always said that it is open for peace talks, whilst Ukraine has repeatedly denied that it is, well, I think that people who want to persuade Ukraine to begin negotiations ought to be setting out the situation to the Ukrainians truthfully and objectively and honestly, dropping the fiction, which, by the way, I'm sure that the people at Strana sincerely believe that the war is in any sort of stalemate. It isn't. Now, I say that over the last 24 hours, we've had confirmation that the F-16s, some F-16s, have been delivered to Ukraine. And in fact, photographs have appeared coming out of Ukraine, one of which shows an F-16 flying in the sky. And we're told that this photograph was taken in Ukrainian airspace. We have no way of confirming that, by the way. And then there is another picture, very impossible picture, by the way, for me to make any sense of, which shows us what to me looks like simply a dark dot flying over the skies of Lvov, town in western Ukraine. And we're told that this is also an F-16. Might have been, I can't say one way or the other. Nonetheless, I am fully prepared to accept that the F-16s have now been delivered. Reports from Bloomberg say that the number of F-16s which have been delivered is very small. We don't know what that means, but I saw a report suggesting 6, another report suggesting 10. It looks as if the number of pilots who trained to fly these F-16s, Ukrainian pilots, is very small. Perhaps between 22 and 28 will have been trained to fly them by the end of this year. Reports are saying that they won't be entering combat before the end of this month. Not clear why there is going to be this delay. Anyway, the F-16s are there. But, of course, we've had report after report, comment after comment, now from multiple different sources that the F-16s are not going to be any sort of game changer for Ukraine. Now, yesterday I discussed at length the fact that there'd been a massive Ukrainian drone attack across Ukraine, much of it, so far as I can see, concentrated in Kiev itself. And the military summary channel yesterday speculated, perhaps correctly, that this drone attack is in some way connected to the F-16s, that the Russians, in effect, are now hunting the F-16s in Kiev. And of course, that could be completely true. It might be exactly what is happening. I'm not in any kind of position to say one way or the other. I mean, it sounds to me entirely plausible. But anyway, the fact is the Russians are able to send fleets of drones across Ukraine. They're able to send fleets of missiles. Perhaps the F-16s can shoot down some of the cruise missiles, the subsonic cruise missiles. Though, of course, if they try to do that, they risk becoming targets themselves. Obviously, the Russians can try and locate them on the airfields. The Ukrainians are building dummies to try to confuse the Russians. I would have thought that by this stage in the war, it would be difficult to confuse the Russians by simply putting up wooden dummies. My guess is that the Russians are now in a position to assess which which are the actual F-16s and which are not. But anyway, I'm not going to get into a discussion about this. Nobody, as far as I know, any longer seems to believe that there's any real prospect that the F-16s can change the situation on the battlefronts to any serious degree. Anyway, so the F-16s are there. The drones, the Russian drones are there. By the way, there was a report yesterday that the Chinese government is finally taking steps to restrict the supply, the sale of drones which could be converted into FPV drones. From what I can understand, the Russians basically manufacture their drones, including their FPV drones. The Ukrainians, maybe I'm doing them a huge injustice here, and maybe that this is wrong, but the Ukrainians apparently adapt their drones from commercial products, though they do this with great ingenuity and skill. And it's been suggested that many of the drones that they've been using, the Ukrainian drones, are actually of Chinese provenance, and it could be that the Chinese are finally taking steps to restrict their sales. Well, that might not be an easy thing for the Chinese to do. No doubt third parties can buy these drones and then they can be sold on to the Russians through all kinds of to the Ukrainians through all kinds of middlemen and all that. So, it might not be that effective overall. But possibly, conceivably, we might actually start to see this have an effect on the ability of Ukraine to deploy large numbers of drones over its skies, in which case I would suggest that would have a bigger impact on the battle, on the actual battle, than the F-16s would do, because of Ukraine's extreme shortage, extreme reliance on FPV drones. But anyway, let's move on to rather firmer ground and talk about what is actually happening on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, the blogger, the Russian blogger, Boris Rozhin, who publishes under the name of Colonel Kassad, has provided us with a summary of latest events, principally in the Toretsk area, and it's clear that the Russians are continuing to make further and greater advances in the Toretsk area. I'm going to read briefly what he says. He says that in New York, the Russian armed forces continue to advance deeper into the village, taking control of the Chleb Zavod baking factory, it's a bread factory, and the remains of the Petrovsky machine building plant. Russian troops continue to advance towards Pantelimonovka, taking up new positions in the hills overlooking the town. This is another area apparently in the Toretsk area. In the village of Druzhba, this is on another part of the Toretsk area, Russian troops took control of Dzerzhinsky Street, and in the village of Artyomovo, this is Zheleznye, which is the Ukrainian village of Zheleznye, an operation began to capture the waste heap of the Artyom mine, with the Russian army advancing from two directions to outflank the height. So this is one of those big waste heaps that lie on the way of the Russian forces as they advance towards the town of Toretsk itself. There's two of these coal mines with their waste heaps. The Russians appear to be acting to capture both, and Colonel Kassad is telling us, Boris Rozhin is telling us, that the Russians have taken at least one of these coal mining areas into a pincer. Now, Boris Rozhin then provides us with some information about what is happening in the Ocheretino, Avdeevka, Pakrovsk area. And here, the Russian advances have resumed again, and they continue to be rapid and in some respects dynamic. So Boris Rozhin says that the Russians have taken control of most of the village of Timofeevka. The village of Timofeevka is located southwest of the village of Vozvyzhenka. It is very, very close to the road, the supply road, from Prakrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. And according to Boris Rozhin, the Russians have now captured most of this village. In fact, there were reports this morning that the Russians have captured all of this village, which, if true, means that the attack on Vozvyzhenka itself is probably now days away. Anyway, he also says that the Russians have launched an attack on Ivanovka from the south and east. In addition, Russian troops advanced south of Veselye along the railway in the direction of Sergeyevka. Now, can I just say, Veselye, another village, this is the road that leads from the village of Progress, which the Russians captured some weeks ago, to Mirnograd and to Pakrovsk itself. As I've discussed on many occasions, Veselye lies to the south of this road. Ivanovka lies to the north of this road. The Russians capture both of these villages, then they're able to advance further along this road to the next big village, which is Grodivka, village of about 1,200 people. Once Grodivka itself is captured, the way is open to reach Mirnograd itself. There is no other important or significant settlement between Grodivka and Mirnograd. Well, as it happens, shortly after this particular post of Boris Rozhin's was published, reports appeared this morning that Veseliye itself has now been captured, that the Russians have now, in fact, successfully captured Veseliye, and that they are, in other words, closer to securing their positions along this road, putting them in a stronger position to advance further towards Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. Russian advances in this critical area, the Pokrovsk area, as I say, look to be remorseless, and there doesn't seem to be any ability on the part of the Ukrainian military to hold them back. Now, there's been more news from other battlefronts. Last night, I was hearing reports that the 79th Brigade are again talking about a critical situation in the village of Konstantinovka, basically saying that the Russians have surrounded them inside Konstantinovka. This is not strictly true. They still have access to the west. They could still retreat from Konstantinovka by retreating from the west, but it's clear that the Russians are in fire control, that they can shell and launch strikes on all the major supply roads, and that it's going to be very difficult indeed for the 79th Brigade to hold on to Konstantinovka itself for very much longer. So a rapidly deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians there. There's also been news from Volchansk. Now, I'm not sure whether this news has come from Group of North Forces North, but I am assuming that it has done. But Volchansk in Kharkiv region, obviously, there's been a major battle underway there, but the latest reports say that the Russians have moved, the Group of Forces North, they moved closer to the center of the area of the high-rise buildings of the citadel. There's a report to this effect on Slavyangrad. Slavyangrad, very reliable site which publishes information about the battle lines. If this is true, if it is indeed the case that the high-rise building area is about to fall, that the Russians have reached the center of it, then it's likely, as I said, that the citadel area is indeed about to fall, in which case the battle for northern Volchansk will, I think, be coming towards its end, at which point, in addition, the Russians will be able to occupy probably the rest of Volchansk without an excessive amount of difficulty. And, well, with the fall of Volchansk, I've already discussed in other programs how the situation of the Ukrainian defenders in Kupiansk and Izium and all of those places in southern Kharkiv region, that it become incredibly precarious as well. Now, all of this news in aggregate about the movements on the front lines for the Ukrainians is very, very serious. But perhaps even more dramatic is the claim from the Russian Defense Ministry about the scale of Ukrainian losses. The Russian Defense Ministry is now saying that in July, Ukraine lost 60,000 men in the area of the special military operation. And Ukraine itself is saying that it is recruiting 30,000 men a month. The figure of 60,000, it's important again to stress this, includes both dead and wounded. I don't know what proportion of the wounded are severely wounded. Putin, some time ago, suggested that the proportion of Ukrainian severely wounded was unusually high, because of various problems that have arisen within the Ukrainian military system. But anyway, whether or not that is true, the fact is, if we take the figure of 60,000, which is, to repeat again, a Russian figure at face value, then the Ukrainians are losing twice as many men as they claim to be recruiting. And I'll just read the report from TASS, which discusses this. It says that from 1st to 5th July, Ukrainian losses were up to 9,875 troops in all theatres of military operations. That's over a 4-day period. They were up to 14,070 from July 6th to July 12th, and up to 13,075 from July 13th to July 19th. The figure was up to 23,610 in the period from July 20th to July 31st. By the way, that is astonishing. Over a 11-day period, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians lost 23,610 men dead and wounded on the battlefield. And TASS then goes on to say this means Ukraine's losses totaled up to 60,630 servicemen in July. The enemy's daily losses average about 2,000 people. Most losses happen in the areas of responsibility of Russian battle groups south and west. So there you go. That's what the Russians say. Of course, the Ukrainians would deny this, but then they never give us figures for losses. And as I discussed, there was an article recently, not about Ukrainian losses, but about American shell production, which provided a comment, which reported a comment by a Ukrainian official who is a member of the General Staff, who discussed what Ukrainian losses were like at earlier stages in the war, when the discrepancy in ammunition between the Russians and the Ukrainians was less than it is now. And, well, those comments appeared to corroborate the claims by the Russians of Ukrainian losses that they were making at that time, which rather suggests that Ukrainian losses are indeed being reported by the Russians within a fair measure of correctness. We're not talking about absolute accuracy here. Anyway, there we go. So, given this situation, given the fact that the Russians are now just a few kilometers from Pokrovsk, that Ukraine is suffering losses on this kind of scale, according to the Russians, given that the Ukrainians are suffering the damage that they are indeed suffering, I don't see that this is in any shape or form a stalemate type situation. The Russians, on the contrary, are likely to be able to continue to advance westwards, and Ukraine is much more short of time than some people, I think, assume it to be. Now, the Russians have made fairly clear their deep cynicism about this whole topic of negotiations with Ukraine. And there's been a very cynical article about this whole topic that's appeared recently in the Russian newspaper Izvestia. And it basically says that, well, it sort of slightly mocks Stubb's claim, Finnish President Stubb's claim that Ukraine is in a stronger position because of the resumption of Western aid. It says what exactly Stubb means, I'm quoting from the article, is not very clear, since Russian forces liberated more than 10 settlements in July alone and continue to hold the general initiative in the special military operations zone, military analysts told Izvestia. The Ukrainians are severely lacking in personnel amid obvious problems with mobilization. In any case, the political landscape in the West is changing, as seen by the growing popularity of right-wing parties in the European Parliament elections and wherever. And they also discuss, at some levels, the complicated political situation in the United States. But then we have a comment from a senior researcher, Dmitry Ofitserov-Belsky, who has spoken to Izvestia about the overall question of negotiations. And it's important to say that he appears to be working at the Institute of International Relations and World Economy in Moscow. That is one of the most elite academic institutions dealing with international questions in Russia. It's very, very much a training ground for Russian diplomats. That's where they tend to take their first degrees before moving on to the diplomatic school. But anyway, he is quoted by Izvestia as saying this: being tired of the conflict and wanting to end it are two different things. The conflict can be frozen, but to end it, you need concrete proposals. It's possible they just want to bring Russia into the negotiation process so that they can freeze the conflict and then resume it when they need to. As for the Russian leadership, if Kiev really wants to show that it's ready for communication, it must first cancel its own decree which bans negotiations. So far, Ukraine has not done this, which means that any rhetoric about peace process can be seen as nothing more than testing the waters to see how Russia responds. So, fair insight into the deep cynicism that you're getting from the Russian side. Now, Zelensky himself has come forward with a new idea. He's very fertile with ideas. He says that because the surrender of territory would be such a tremendous problem for Ukraine, Ukraine can only agree to it following a referendum. That might not be something that the Russians are prepared to agree to. And what if there is a ceasefire? And on the basis that the Ukrainians pull out from the 4 regions, and then Zelensky calls his referendum, and the Ukrainian people in that referendum are reported to have rejected the withdrawal from this territory. Are the Russians supposed in that case to resume military operations? I find this difficult to imagine. And of course, it could be, as I said, that this device of a referendum that Zelensky is talking about is another means to simply play for time. Though time, again, to achieve what? It's never clear. This morning, the Russian Defense Ministry made further claims that Russia has just destroyed 3 more Ukrainian Patriot missile launchers. This is reported apparently by Battle Group South. This is from the Russian Defense Ministry, operational tactical aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, missile troops, and artillery of the Russian group of forces struck 3 US-made Patriot surface-to-air missile launchers, a UAV control post, and trains with personnel and ammunition, massed enemy firepower, manpower, and military equipment in 147 areas. Could it be that it was an attack on the Patriot missile batteries, that was what that big drone attack that I discussed earlier in the program on Kiev was actually all about? Who's to say? But anyway, I don't think Ukraine has very much time. I find the whole idea of Ukraine spinning out the time really bizarre. Not only is Ukraine losing the war, but it is losing people at an accelerating rate. And of course, if we have a crisis in Pakrovsk, say, over the next few weeks, which is now looking like a distinct possibility, well, how can one say then that Ukraine is in a strong position to begin negotiations? The time to negotiate is now. It is, in fact, when I say it is now, the time to negotiate was years ago, months ago. Negotiating now is negotiating very late in the day indeed. Postponing negotiations further is to compound the folly of not negotiating in good faith and seriously before. And I think that is the only sensible message that can be made at this time. Anyway, some things are happening in the world which do suggest that contacts and communications between the Russians, at least, and Western governments are starting to recover from the terrible level that they have reached. There's reports that Gershkovich and Whelan, the 2 Americans who have been held in detention with Russia, are being exchanged by the Russians and the Western powers in what appears to be a very, very large and very, very complex exchange indeed. Up to 27 people are being exchanged. It'd be interesting to find out exactly how this is being conducted. No doubt I will come back to that in my next program. It's good in a way that all of these people are free. In my opinion, even if Gershkovich really was guilty of espionage in the way that the Russians say, the correct and proper thing would have been to expel him from Russia. I think the Russian decision to arrest him, prosecute him, almost certainly was in order to gain a card in order for the Russians to get some of their own people released from the West. If that is correct, then of course they have won this game. Cynical game though it is. But then, as we've seen, international relations are often conducted in a very cynical way. I'm not going to say more about this exchange at the moment, but it does seem at least that the Russians and the Americans have been talking to each other, and that might be a good thing. They need to talk to each other a lot, not just about Ukraine, but about the Middle East especially, which, as I've discussed previously in my program, is now on the brink of exploding. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Lots of things you can find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.